On the morning of June 19, 1944, somewhere over the Philippine Sea, a young Japanese scout pilot did something no Japanese scout pilot had been trained to do. He started counting out loud. His voice came through the radio of the carrier Taiho broken, shaking, the voice of a man who could not believe his own eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On the bridge of the flagship, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, 57 years old, 2 meters tall, the man his sailors called the Gargoyle, heard the count climb past 8 and past 10 and waited for it to stop. It did not stop. 15 aircraft carriers. Repeat, 15. Ozawa said nothing. The officers around him said later that the silence on the bridge lasted a long time, because the number the scout pilot had just radioed back was not, in any version of the war the Japanese Navy had been preparing to fight for 40 years, a possible number. 18 months earlier, the United States Navy had owned 4 operational aircraft carriers in the entire Pacific. Now, on a morning Ozawa had been told would be the Empire's Tsushima, there were 15 of them. Most of them brand new, most of them named for ships the Japanese had themselves sunk. Ozawa stood on the bridge of an aircraft carrier called Taiho. She was 3 months old, nearly 37,000 tons fully loaded, a flight deck plated against 500-kilogram bombs, the most advanced warship the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever launched. Around her steamed 8 more carriers, 7 battleships, 440 aircraft, 30,000 men. To understand why 15 American carriers in the Philippine Sea was not just bad news but an impossible number, a number that, in the mind of every senior Japanese admiral that morning, broke something foundational about the war they thought they were fighting, you have to go back. Not 3 years to Pearl Harbor, not 2 years to Midway, but 90 days. 90 days between the 15th of March and the 15th of June 1944. In that window, from the death of Admiral Minechi Koga in a typhoon off the Philippines to the American landings on Saipan, Task Force 58 completed its final form. Carrier after carrier joined, most of them Essex class, most of them brand new. To the Japanese, watching from intercepted radio traffic and submarine sightings, it was as though American carriers were materializing out of empty ocean. And it all began with a warning that was given, a warning that was buried, a warning whose author was dead before the day at sea would come. In 1905, off an island called Tsushima, a Japanese fleet under Admiral Togo Haihachiro annihilated the Russian Imperial Navy in a single afternoon. 21 Russian ships sunk, 7 captured, over 5,000 Russian sailors dead, Japanese losses, 3 torpedo boats. It was the most lopsided naval victory in modern history. It taught the Imperial Japanese Navy a lesson that would haunt it for 40 years. The lesson was called Kantai Kessen. The decisive battle, the belief that wars at sea were won by a single crushing engagement in which a smaller, more skillful fleet could destroy a larger one. Every Japanese naval officer who graduated from Etajima, the academy, studied Tsushima the way Christians study the crucifixion. It was the founding miracle, proof that spirit could defeat steel. By 1941, Japan had built a navy designed entirely around finding the Americans, drawing them west, and destroying them in one Tsushima-like blow. And to deliver that blow, Japan had built the finest carrier force in the world, Akagi Kaga Soyu Heiyu Shokaku. Zuikaku, 6 fleet carriers, plus 4 light carriers, 10 ships carrying the best naval aviators on the planet, men who had trained 2,000 hours before their first combat flight. Pilots who could place a torpedo into the hull of a moving cruiser at dusk. The Zero fighter outclassed every American aircraft in the Pacific. The Type 91 aerial torpedo could be dropped in shallow water, a capability the US Navy did not have and would not understand until it was too late. In December 1941, Japan had 10 carriers, the United States had 7, and 3 of those were in the Atlantic. The arithmetic of the Pacific favored Tokyo, and then there was the man who knew it was a lie, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the most powerful naval officer in the Empire, and the only senior admiral who had actually seen America. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He had served as naval attaché in Washington. He had ridden trains through Pennsylvania and Ohio and watched the steel mills of Pittsburgh light the sky red at night. He had walked the assembly lines in Detroit, where Ford was building a car every 24 seconds, and he had understood, viscerally, in a way no other Japanese admiral understood, what America could become if it ever decided to make weapons instead of automobiles. Throughout 1941, in letters to Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe and to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa, Yamamoto wrote a warning that was unambiguous. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have utterly no confidence. He went further. He wrote that Japan must seek a diplomatic settlement, that a long war was unwinnable, that the industrial gap between Japan and America was not a difference of degree, it was a difference of kind. The letter went up to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, and here is the twist that almost no Japanese officer at sea ever knew. The full text of Yamamoto's warning, by all surviving evidence, never reached the men who made the final decision for war. Only the first half, the promise of 6 months of victory, was widely quoted in the corridors of the Naval General Staff. The second half, the part where Yamamoto had written that he had utterly no confidence in a long war, was quietly set aside. The men who decided for war heard only the promise of victory. The man who had given them the warning would die 2 years later, shot down by American P-38s over Bougainville on the 18th of April 1943, before he could ever say, "I told you so." His warning had been silenced before the war began. His prophecy had been buried inside the very building that ordered Pearl Harbor. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves against the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Over 2,400 Americans died. Japanese losses, 29 aircraft, 5 submarines. The strike force, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, retired east without losing a single ship. It looked like Tsushima. It felt like Tsushima. It was not Tsushima. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, had been at sea. They had escaped. Yamamoto, receiving the news aboard his flagship in the inland sea, was reportedly subdued. He understood what his subordinates did not. The carriers had survived. The war had not been decided. He had 6 months. For 6 months, Japanese carriers swept the Pacific. They covered the conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. They struck Ceylon. They drove the Royal Navy back to East Africa. Every prediction Yamamoto had made about running wild came true. Then came Midway. On the 4th of June 1942, exactly 6 months and 4 days after Pearl Harbor, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kagasoryu, Hiryu, were burning. American dive bombers from Enterprise, Yorktown and Hornet caught them with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft on their flight decks. The fires were uncontainable. In 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers were doomed. Hiryu lasted into the night. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen died. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots, men who had trained for years, were killed. Yamamoto's 6 months were over. His prophecy had hit the calendar exactly. And here is the second turn, the second hidden wound. Because the man Tokyo finally chose to lead the surviving Japanese carriers, to take command of the broken air fleet, was Jisaburo Ozawa. The same Ozawa who, before the war, had been the first high-ranking Japanese officer to advocate concentrating all the carriers into a single unified air fleet. The same Ozawa whose doctrine the Imperial Navy had finally adopted in 1942. He took command on the 11th of November 1942, replacing Nagumo. But by November 1942, the men who could fly his doctrine were already dead. They had died over Midway. They had died in the long grinding meat grinder of the Solomons. The veterans of Pearl Harbor, the 2,000-hour pilots, the men who had trained for Tsushima at sea, were almost all gone. Ozawa inherited the corpse of the force he had spent his career designing. He would now spend the next 2 years trying to fight a decisive battle with men who could not yet land on a carrier deck at night. While Ozawa was being handed the wreck of Japan's carrier aviation 11,000 kilometers to the east in the tidewater shipyards of Virginia and Massachusetts, something else was happening. On the 28th of April 1941, 8 months before Pearl Harbor, the keel of a new American aircraft carrier had been laid at Newport News Shipbuilding. She was hull number CV9, her name was USS Essex, she was the lead ship of a new class, and by the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, 5 more of her sisters were already under construction. The day after the attack, Congress appropriated funds for 19 more. Every shipyard on the East Coast capable of building capital ships received contracts. Newport News, Virginia, 7 hulls. Bethlehem Steel at Fall River, Quincy, 5 hulls. Brooklyn Navy Yard, New York, 5. Norfolk Navy Yard, Virginia, 4 hulls. Philadelphia Navy Yard, 3 hulls. 24 carriers ordered, 27,000 tons each. 888 feet long, each capable of carrying 90 aircraft. Before the war, naval experts on both sides of the Pacific had agreed on one thing: a fleet carrier required 3 to 4 years to build. Newport News built USS Essex in 20 months, USS Yorktown, the second of the class, in 16. By 1944 the average had fallen below 15. The secret was not magic, it was prefabrication. It was 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week. It was over 30,000 workers in one yard in Newport News alone. It was women, hundreds of thousands of them, walking through gates that had been male only since the yards were built. Welders, riveters, electricians, crane operators. Rosie the Riveter was not a poster, she was a payroll number. USS Essex was commissioned on the 30th of December 1942. USS Lexington in February 1943, USS Bunker Hill in May, USS Intrepid in August, USS Hornet in November, USS Wasp in November. 7 Essex-class carriers commissioned in 1943 alone. The names mattered: Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, Hornet, all named for ships sunk in the first year of the war. Every carrier the Japanese had killed was being replaced by a larger, faster, more lethal ship bearing the same name. In Tokyo, Japanese naval intelligence read the diplomatic cables, watched the Lloyds of London insurance registers, counted the launches. They knew in raw data what was happening. They did not believe it. In the spring of 1944, the Pacific War pivoted on 3 deaths and 1 promotion. The first death was the pilot's. There had been so many small deaths over the Solomons that no one could count them anymore, only their absence from the squadrons. The second death came on the 18th of April 1943, when Yamamoto's transport bomber was shot down over Bougainville. The American P-38s had been waiting. Yamamoto's body was found beneath a tree in the jungle, his white-gloved hand still resting on the hilt of his sword. With him in the formation in a second bomber had been his chief of staff, a reserved, hawk-faced rear admiral from Okayama named Matomi Ugaki. Ugaki was 53 years old that day. He survived. The second bomber ditched into the sea. He was pulled from the water with multiple fractures, severe burns, and the knowledge that the man he had served for 2 years was dead. He spent 9 months in hospitals. He came back to sea duty on the 25th February 1944, given command of Battleship Division 1, the most powerful surface force left in the Empire. The battleships Yamato, Musashi, Nagato. He carried 2 things from his old life: a diary which he had been keeping daily since 1941. He called it Sensoroku, the war record, and a small ceremonial short sword given to him by Admiral Yamamoto. He would carry both of them to the end. The third death came on the 31st of March 1944. Admiral Minechi Koga, who had replaced Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, was flying between command headquarters in the Philippines when his aircraft entered a typhoon. The plane was never found. Koga, his staff, and the operational plans for the defense of the Marianas all vanished into the South China Sea. On the 3rd of May 1944, Tokyo announced his successor, Admiral Somu Toyoda, 59 years old, a torpedo and gunnery specialist, a man who in the 1930s had argued openly that a war with the United States was unwinnable, and who had been sidelined for saying it. Now they were giving him the war. Now they were ordering him to win it. On the 13th of June 1944, Toyoda sent a signal to Vice Admiral Ozawa, whose 9 carriers were already raising steam at the anchorage of Tawi Tawi off Borneo. The signal was a quotation. The same words Admiral Togo had signaled to his fleet 39 years earlier, before Tsushima. The fate of the Empire rests on this one battle. Let every man do his utmost. On Taiyo, Ozawa read the order. He was the man who had designed the doctrine. He had inherited a hollow force. He was being sent now to fight at Tsushima with pilots who could barely land at sea. He gave the order to sortie. Far to the east, beyond the horizon Ozawa was already searching, Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell was waiting on the flag bridge of USS Lexington, the second Lexington, with 15 carriers and 905 aircraft and 100,000 men. And somewhere on the staff of Battleship Division 1, in a small steel cabin aboard Yamato, Motomi Ugaki opened his diary and began to write. The anchorage at Tawi Tawi was a place at the edge of the world. It sat off the northeast corner of Borneo, in the warm green waters where the Sulu Sea meets the Celebes. There were palm trees, there were small islands wrapped in coral, there were also, 200 meters down, American submarines. For the entire spring of 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had been forced to keep his carriers anchored there because Japan no longer had enough fuel to run training exercises at sea. Worse, when his pilots did try to practice at sea, American submarines found them. On the 22nd of May, the submarine USS Puffer fired a spread of torpedoes at the light carrier Chitose during a training run. The torpedoes missed in her wake. Ozawa that evening gave the order that haunted him for the rest of his life. He forbade his pilots from training on the open ocean. His air groups, by June 1944, contained 440 aircraft and roughly the same number of pilots. The veterans, the ones left over from Pearl Harbor and Midway and the Solomons, could be counted in the dozens. The rest were boys. Most had fewer than 100 hours of flight time. Some had never landed on a moving carrier at sea. Ozawa knew this. He carried the knowledge into his sortie the way a man carries an unhealed wound. On the 13th of June 1944, his 9 carriers raised anchor. The plan was called a go. It was built on 3 assumptions. First, that Japanese aircraft had longer range than American aircraft. They could strike Mitch's fleet at distances American planes could not return. Second, that hundreds of land-based Japanese aircraft on Guam, Saipan, Tinian and Rota would coordinate with the carrier strike. Ozawa's pilots would launch from the west, hit the Americans, land on Mariana's airfields to refuel and rearm, then strike again on the way home. The shuttle strike. Third, that his veteran pilots, however few, would offset the American numerical advantage. He left Tawi Tawi believing all 3. In the next 96 hours, every one of those assumptions would die. The first to die was the second. Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell had been a naval aviator since 1916. He was 56 years old. The skin of his face was the color of an old saddle from 40 years on a flight deck in the wind and the sun. He was small and quiet, and he wore a cap with a long soft bill pulled down over his eyes against the glare. He almost never raised his voice. From the 11th of June, while Ozawa was still preparing to sortie, Mitch's carriers had been working over the Marianas. 208 Hellcat fighters swept Saipan, Tinian, Guam and Rota on the first day. They hit airfields, they hit fuel dumps, they hit hangars, they strafed parked aircraft into burning skeletons. On the second day they came back. On the third day they came back again. By the 18th of June, the day Ozawa was closing on the battle area, Mitch's task force had destroyed more than 200 Japanese land-based aircraft on or near the Marianas, most of them on the ground before they could take off. Here is the part that mattered most. The radio operators who would have reported this catastrophe to Ozawa were dead. The communications officers who would have warned him that the shuttle was gone, that the runways were craters, that the fuel had burned, they were buried under their own coral. The signal traffic from the Marianas to the combined fleet went silent because there was no one left in the Marianas with the equipment to send it. Ozawa steamed east believing his airfields were waiting. They were not. They were ash. He did not know. The second assumption began to die on the 15th of June. That afternoon, the American submarine USS Flying Fish, patrolling outside the San Bernardino Strait in the Philippines, raised her periscope and saw the unmistakable shapes of Japanese carriers steaming northeast through the strait. Ozawa's force putting to sea. 1 hour later, the submarine USS Seahorse, operating 200 miles to the south, sighted Vice Admiral Ugaki's battleship division steaming north to rendezvous with Ozawa. Both reports were on Admiral Raymond Spruance's desk in less than 12 hours. By the 17th of June, a third submarine, USS Kavala, was riding in the wake of the Japanese oilers refueling Ozawa's fleet, sending position reports every few hours. Spruance, 57 years old, methodical, almost monastically calm, knew where the Japanese were, knew where they were heading, knew when they would arrive. There would be no surprise, there would be no Tsushima. Ozawa, meanwhile, had nothing. His own scout planes flew. They were shot down by American carrier patrols or returned with nothing. He believed he was hunting blind in fog. He was, in fact, being watched on the radar screens of 15 carriers 300 miles ahead. On the evening of the 18th of June, the third assumption almost saved him. A scout plane from Carrier Division 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Sueo Obayashi, 53 years old, a competent and experienced carrier officer, spotted Task Force 58 at last light. Obayashi did not hesitate. He began launching a strike, 67 aircraft, a dusk attack on an enemy he could see clearly while remaining invisible himself. Mitscher, at that moment, did not know any Japanese carriers were within range. The strike, properly delivered, might have caught American flight decks crowded with parked aircraft in the worst possible posture. Obayashi's aircraft were warming on the deck of Junyo when the recall order arrived from Ozawa. Stand down. Wait for morning. Stick to the plan. The aircraft were rolled back into the hangars. The pilots were sent below. The opportunity died in the dusk. Ozawa was not reckless. He was in fact methodical and intelligent, but he was committed to Eigo, and Eigo called for a coordinated daylight strike with land-based air support that had already been destroyed and that he did not know was destroyed. He chose certainty over chance. He chose the doctrine over the man on the spot. It was the kind of decision that wins peacetime exercises and loses wars. He would never know what Obayashi had seen. Dawn came on the 19th of June 1944 over a flat, glassy sea. At 0830, Carrier Division 3 began launching the first strike. 69 aircraft, 16 Zero fighters, 45 fighter bombers, 8 Jill torpedo planes. They climbed into a sky that was still cool with the morning. At 1000 hours, on the bridge of the destroyer screen 150 miles to the east, an American radar operator, a 20-year-old enlisted technician, hunched over an SK air search set, saw the contact build on his scope. Multiple aircraft. Closing. The warning rippled up the chain in seconds. At 10:19, Mitscher gave the order across the fleet. Hey Rube, get the fighters back from Guam, bring them home, launch everything that can fly. At 10:23, 15 carriers swung into the wind. The decks began to roar. Within a single minute, the first Hellcats were climbing off the bow catapults of USS Lexington, USS Yorktown, USS Bunker Hill, USS Hornet, USS Wasp, USS Essex. The light carriers of Task Force 58, below Wood, Bataan, Princeton, Cabot, Monterey, Langley, San Jacinto, sent up their own. 300 Grumman F-6F Hellcats clawed for altitude. The Japanese were 75 miles out and climbing into a wall. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter that had a name before the day was over. The Hellcats were faster than the Zero in level flight. They were heavier. They had armor plate behind the pilot's seat and self-sealing fuel tanks. They had 650 caliber machine guns. Their pilots had averaged more than 300 hours of flight training stateside before they ever saw the Pacific. Many had been flying for 18 months. The Japanese pilots, most of them, had less than 100 hours total in the cockpit. The first wave broke against the Hellcats over 30 miles from the American fleet. 42 of the 69 Japanese aircraft were shot down in the first interception. They did not maneuver. They did not break formation. They flew straight on and they fell into the sea. The handful that survived the air-to-air fight ran into the American screen. Cruisers, destroyers, the new battleship USS South Dakota, the sky over the gun line filled with black puffs, and inside those puffs were the proximity-fused VT shells, a new American invention, an artillery round that detected an aircraft by radar at close range and exploded without needing to hit. The Japanese pilots flew into a curtain of explosions they could not understand. One Japanese bomb struck South Dakota. It killed 27 American sailors and wounded 23. The ship continued firing. Not one Japanese aircraft from the first wave penetrated to a carrier. At 11:07, the second wave was detected. 109 aircraft. It was met 60 miles out. Most did not get closer. Then a third wave. Then a fourth. Each one met the same wall. Each one bled into the same sea. On board USS Lexington, a young Naval Reserve Lieutenant Junior grade named Alexander Vrashew, 25 years old, took off with Fighting Squadron 16, climbed to 19,000 feet, found a formation of 20 Judy dive bombers headed for the carriers, and in 8 minutes shot down 6 of them. He came back to the deck with his guns smoking. He held up 6 fingers for the photographer. The photograph would become one of the most famous images of the Pacific War. By late afternoon, American pilots had a name for what was happening over the Philippine Sea. This is just like an old-time turkey shoot. Across the day, Ozawa launched over 300 carrier aircraft in 4 strike waves. 243 of them did not return. American losses were 29 aircraft, most lost to ditching, accidents or anti-aircraft fire. No American carrier was hit. No American carrier even came under serious attack. Ozawa did not know any of this. His pilots were trained in the Japanese fashion to report enemy losses upon returning. The survivors of his first 3 waves, disoriented, wounded, traumatized, gave him the reports he wanted to hear. 4 American carriers sunk, multiple battleships hit, heavy damage to the enemy fleet. It was all fiction. Not one American carrier had been sunk. Not one had been seriously damaged. The reports were the wishful arithmetic of frightened young men who had seen smoke on the horizon and called it a kill. Ozawa believed them, and because he believed them, he made the decision that turned defeat into annihilation. He chose to remain in the battle area on the 20th of June to recover his victorious aircraft, to refuel them, and to strike again. He had bought a fairy tale. He would pay for it in carriers. At 0909 on the 19th of June, while the air battle was still being fought above the fleet, the submarine USS Albacore had quietly maneuvered into firing position 5,000 yards from a target the size of an apartment building. The target was Taiho. Albacore fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 5 went wide, 1 ran straight. It struck Taiho on the starboard side, forward, abreast the aviation gasoline tanks. The explosion broke a fuel line. It cracked the seals of the Avgas storage spaces. Aviation gasoline, and more dangerously, aviation gasoline vapor, began to seep into the hangar deck and the surrounding compartments. The damage at first looked manageable. Taiho continued steaming at 26 knots. She launched and recovered aircraft. The flight deck was intact. Most of her crew did not even know she had been hit. The fuel vapors continued to spread. This is where the worst kind of war finds the worst kind of irony. Taiho was Japan's most advanced carrier. She had an armored flight deck. She had compartmentalization. She had been designed in some respects on the British model, built to take damage. But her ventilation system, like every Japanese carrier's, had a vulnerability nobody had thought through. The Avgas tanks were not adequately isolated. The vent trunks ran into the hangar. A young damage control officer, his name has not survived in the records, made the decision that killed the ship. He ordered the ventilation system opened wide, full draft, to expel the gasoline fumes. What it did instead was distribute them throughout the hangar, throughout the elevator wells, throughout the lower compartments. At 15:32, 6.5 hours after Albacore's torpedo struck, a single spark, almost certainly from an electrical generator, ignited the gas-air mixture. The explosion lifted Taiho's armored flight deck clean off her hangar. The hull split. Secondary blasts followed as bombs and aviation fuel in the hangar bays detonated in chain. 1,650 men died. Ozawa transferred his flag to the heavy cruiser Haguro. He stood on the cruiser's bridge in his white tropical uniform as his flagship, the most modern carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, 3 months old, slid by the stern, burning, and went under. He did not speak. The staff officers around him later said the silence lasted several minutes. The newest carrier in the Empire had not been killed by torpedoes. She had been killed by her own damage control protocol, by a young officer's reasonable, intelligent, doctrinally correct decision to ventilate fumes. She had been killed in the end by a culture that had never planned to lose a ship to its own gasoline. 43 minutes after the first torpedo struck Taiho, 80 miles to the east, a periscope rose out of the sea. Behind the eyepiece was Commander Herman Kostler of USS Kavala. What he saw framed in his lens took his breath away. A Japanese fleet carrier, 3 destroyers in escort, aircraft circling overhead waiting to land. The carrier was turning into the wind to recover them. It was Shokaku. Shokaku was a veteran. She had been one of the 6 carriers that struck Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. She had fought at the Coral Sea, she had fought at Santa Cruz, she had survived bombs and torpedoes and the deaths of half her air group. She was, by June 1944, one of the last 2 Pearl Harbor carriers still afloat. At 12:20, Kostler fired 6 torpedoes from 1,200 yards. 3 hit. Shokaku began to burn almost immediately. Fires in the aircraft on her flight deck spread to the hangar. The fuel that had been hauled up for the returning planes ignited. Bombs and torpedoes in the hangar bays began to cook off. At 15:01, less than 3 hours after the first torpedo, she rolled and sank. 1,272 men went down with her. The carrier that had been one of the 6 that struck Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, that had launched her dive bombers into the dawn over Hawaii, was killed by a submarine. A submarine, a weapon the Imperial Japanese Navy had spent most of the war treating as secondary, a coastal nuisance, a thing for blockades and reconnaissance, not for sinking carriers. The Americans had taken what the Japanese had ignored and used it to kill the ship that started the war. By the evening of the 19th of June 1944, Ozawa had lost his flagship, his most modern carrier and his oldest veteran. He had launched over 300 aircraft and lost more than 240. The cream of what remained of Japan's naval aviation, the young men who would have been the next generation of veterans, was floating in pieces across 200 miles of the Philippine Sea. He still believed that night that he had sunk 4 American carriers. The officers around him on Haguro described him later as stunned. He spoke little. He gave the orders necessary to refuel the surviving carriers from his oilers. He prepared to continue the battle the next day. He still intended to strike again. He did not know yet that no American carrier had been touched. He did not know yet that the Marianas airfields he had been counting on for the shuttle were craters. He did not know yet that the next morning Mitchell would come for him. He believed that night that he had won. On the battleship Yamato, several hundred miles to the southwest, Vice Admiral Motomi Ugaki was writing. In his cabin, by the dim light of a single bulb, he opened the leather-bound notebook he had carried since 1941. Sensoraku, the war record. He had written in it almost every day for nearly 3 years, through Pearl Harbor, through Midway, through the burial of Yamamoto, through his own 9 months in the hospital. He wrote in his careful hand that he was reading the action reports as they came in. He wrote that the situation was not yet clear. He wrote that he felt a great unease. He could not have known, in that cabin, that the carriers were already lost, that the pilots were already dead, that Ozawa, in the dark, was preparing to be hunted at dawn. On the 20th of June 1944, at 15:40 in the afternoon, a single Avenger torpedo bomber from USS Enterprise, piloted by Lieutenant Robert Nelson, broke through scattered cloud at 5,000 feet and saw the Japanese fleet 220 miles to the northwest. He flashed a contact report. The report was so garbled that Mitscher on Lexington could not at first make sense of it. Then a second message came through, then a third. By 16:10, Mitscher had what he needed. He had Ozawa's position. He had Ozawa's heading. He had perhaps 75 minutes of daylight left. The carriers were too far away. The strike, 226 aircraft, would arrive at sunset. It would have to fight in the last light. Then it would have to fly home 220 miles in full darkness, with fuel gauges already dropping towards zero. Mitscher looked at his staff. He looked at the position. Launch them. 226 aircraft rolled off the decks of the American carriers in 11 minutes. Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers. Some carried 400-500-pound bombs instead of torpedoes. There had not been time to swap loads. They climbed west into a reddening sky. They found Ozawa just before sunset. The strike, in fading light, sank the light carrier Hio. It damaged the carrier Zuikaku. It damaged Chiyoda. It sank 2 fleet oilers, which mattered more to the long-term picture than the Japanese realized, because without those oilers Ozawa could not steam home at high speed. It shot down 65 more Japanese aircraft. American losses to enemy action were 20 planes, but then night came and the Americans had to fly home. They flew home over open ocean, in darkness, with nothing to guide them. Many were already low on fuel before they had attacked. Hellcats began ditching at sea. Avengers ran their tanks dry and went into the water. The radio chatter was the voices of young men in the dark, asking for any heading, any beacon, any compass course back to a ship they could not see. On the bridge of Lexington, Mark Mitcher made a decision that no carrier admiral had ever made before in the history of warfare. He gave the order to turn on the lights, every searchlight in Task Force 58, every signal lamp, every running light. Every truck light on a flight deck. The destroyers fired star shells into the sky. The carriers turned themselves into beacons in the night, knowing that somewhere in the dark were Japanese submarines that would see them too. He did it anyway. He did it because his pilots were out there. He did it because they were his. For 2 hours, 15 American carriers ran lit up like cities in the open Pacific, aircraft homed in by sight, by the glow on the horizon, by the long bright streaks of searchlights stabbing up into the clouds. Some landed on their own ship, most landed on whatever deck they could find. Some ditched alongside destroyers and were pulled out of the water by sailors with grappling hooks. Of the 180 pilots and crewmen who went into the sea that night, 143 were recovered alive. 80 aircraft were lost, not to enemy fire, to darkness and fuel. It was the most extraordinary act of personal command in the carrier war. And it was possible only because Mitcher knew, even if he did not say it, that he could afford to lose 80 aircraft. The factories would build more. The Mariana airfields he had just seized would soon refuel his fleet. Behind him, in the shipyards of Newport News and Quincy, more carriers were sliding off the ways every month. On the battleship Yamato, Ugaki opened his diary that night. He wrote what every Japanese senior officer would now have to live with, even if no one yet said it aloud. The aerial battle of June 19, he wrote, ended with extremely unsatisfactory results. He paused. He wrote one more line. Our naval air power has been destroyed. He closed the diary. He turned out the light. Outside, in the dark Philippine Sea, the war had changed forever, and the men whose lives had been built around the doctrine of decisive battle were about to discover what comes after the decisive battle is lost. The mobile fleet limped back to Okinawa across 4 days of empty ocean, then continued north toward the inland sea. Ozawa stood on the bridge of the cruiser Haguro and watched the carriers he had left, Zuikaku, the wounded Junyo, the surviving light carriers, trail him in a loose, broken line. The fuel oilers he depended on had been sunk by Mitcher's last strike. The carriers themselves were nearly empty of aircraft. The flight decks in daylight looked clean and white and useless. He had taken 9 carriers to sea. He was bringing 6 home. He had taken 440 aircraft. He was bringing roughly 100 back, many of them damaged. He had taken 30,000 men. Nearly 3,000 were dead. The reconnaissance reports caught up with him in stages, the way bad news always finds a man, one piece, then another, then everything at once. The first piece was the count. Japanese aerial reconnaissance on the day of the battle had photographed Task Force 58. The photographs were developed at Yokosuka and forwarded to the Combined Fleet Headquarters. The intelligence officers counted and recounted and counted again. 15 American carriers. Not 8, not 10, not the figure that Ozawa's planners had calculated. 15, 6 of them Essex-class fleet carriers commissioned within the previous 12 months. Most of them named for ships the Japanese had themselves sunk. The second piece was harder. The action reports, when compiled and compared with American radio intercepts and with photographs taken on the 20th June, told a story no one in the headquarters at first wanted to write down. The 4 American carriers Ozawa's pilots had claimed on the 19th of June had never existed outside the pilots' own panicked imaginations. The fleet they had attacked, at the cost of more than 300 aircraft, was completely intact. It was refueling. It was preparing to come west and finish them. Ozawa read the report alone in his cabin. He did not call for his staff. He wrote out his resignation in his own hand. He requested to be relieved of command of the mobile fleet. He took responsibility for the disaster. He did not blame his pilots. He did not blame his ship captains. He did not blame the dead. He sent the letter to Tokyo. 2 days later, the answer came back from Admiral Somu Toyoda, refused. Toyoda did not refuse it because Ozawa had performed well. He refused it because there was no one else. The combined fleet had lost Yamamoto in 1943. It had lost Koga in March. Nagumo was about to die. The senior carrier officers who remained could be counted on the fingers of one hand, and Ozawa was the best of them. The Empire could not afford the gesture of accepting his resignation. It needed his body in the chair, regardless of what was happening inside the man. A fellow flag officer, the name has not survived in the records, was sent to talk Ozawa out of suicide. The conversation, by the account that came down to us through Japanese post-war interrogations, was brief. "You are the only one of the admirals at the Marianas," the officer said, "who completed his assigned mission." It was not exactly a comfort, it was not exactly a lie. Ozawa had been ordered to engage. He had engaged. Everything that had followed from forces larger than him. He put the sword back. He went back to sea. 2 weeks later, on the small volcanic island of Saipan, another senior admiral made the other choice. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was 57 years old. He had commanded the carrier strike force that hit Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. He had commanded the carriers at Midway. After Midway, he had been quietly moved to a series of smaller commands, blamed in private by the Naval General Staff for the 4 carriers lost off Midway Atoll, although no one had ever quite blamed him to his face. In the spring of 1944, he had been given command of the Central Pacific Area Fleet, headquartered on Saipan. It was a paper command. He had almost no ships. When the American Marines came ashore on the 15th of June, he had nothing to fight them with except a few thousand naval infantry and the rifle he carried himself. On the 6th of July 1944, with the American line less than 2 kilometers from his headquarters cave, Nagumo took out his service pistol. He sat down. He shot himself through the temple. The man who had launched the war died in a hole in the ground, alone. 1,500 miles to the northwest, in a fleet headquarters bunker buried beneath the campus of Keio University outside Tokyo, Toyoda received the news. He did not write a long entry, he did not speak much, but he understood by July of 1944 what the surviving senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were beginning to understand in their different ways and in their different cabins. The war was finished, not finished in days, not finished in weeks. There would be one more year of dying. There would be Leyte, there would be Iwo Jima, there would be Okinawa, there would be the kamikazes and the firebombings and the 2 cities that ended in white light. But the carrier war, the war for the Pacific, had been decided on the 19th of June 1944 in a stretch of sea 500 miles wide by a side that could replace what it lost faster than the other side could lose it. Toyoda, after the war, said this plainly to American interrogators. He did not embellish, he did not excuse, he simply said, "I understood after the Marianas that we had lost the war at sea." 4 months later, in October 1944, Ozawa went back to sea one more time. The plan was called Shogo. It was a desperate 3-pronged strike at the American invasion of the Philippines. The main blow would come from Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, 5 battleships, led by the giants Yamato and Musashi, advancing on Leyte through the central Philippines to fall on the American landing beaches at Leyte Gulf. Ozawa's role in the plan was simpler. He was the decoy. He took the carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose and Chiyoda. They were the last carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Between them they carried 108 aircraft, fewer than a single Essex-class carrier carried by itself. Many of his pilots could not perform a carrier landing. Their job was not to fight, their job was to be seen. To be photographed, to draw Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet northward, away from Kurita, away from the landings, away from the beaches. Ozawa sailed knowing he was bait. He sailed knowing his ships, including Zuikaku, the last surviving Pearl Harbor carrier, would almost certainly be sunk under him. On the 25th October 1944, Halsey took the bait. He turned his entire fast carrier force north and came for Ozawa with everything he had. Over 1,000 American aircraft fell on 4 obsolete Japanese flight decks in the open ocean. Chitose sank at 09:37. Chiyoda sank in the afternoon. Zuiho sank at 15:26. Zuikaku, the carrier whose dive bombers had hit Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the last veteran of that morning still afloat, rolled over at 14:14 and went down with her battle flag still flying from the mainmast. Her sailors stood on the listing flight deck and saluted as she went under. When she disappeared beneath the Philippine Sea, Japanese carrier aviation, as a fighting force, ended. Ozawa survived. He had executed the decoy mission with skill. Halsey had been pulled 400 miles out of position. Kurita's center force had broken through San Bernardino Strait unopposed. It made no difference. Off Samar, Kurita ran into Taffy 3, a tiny American formation of escort carriers and destroyers. Escort carriers, converted merchant hulls, the smallest carriers in the American fleet, crews of perhaps 1,500 men against the biggest battleships in the world. The destroyers charged. Their captains had no orders to retreat. They steamed into the muzzles of Yamato's 18-inch guns, and they fired what torpedoes they had, and they kept firing until they sank. Kurita, on the bridge of his cruiser, looking at the strange small carriers he could not at first identify, at the destroyers charging him through smoke, at the aircraft attacking him from every direction, lost his nerve and turned around. He had been within 2 hours of the American beaches. He turned around and went home. When his interrogators asked him after the war what he remembered most about that morning, he did not talk about strategy. He did not talk about the destroyers. He talked about the aircraft. They never stopped, he said. Every time we shot one down, more came. He had not known that morning that those aircraft were coming from converted merchant ships. He had assumed they were Essex class. The fact that he had assumed it, the fact that by October of 1944 a Japanese fleet commander could no longer tell the difference between a fleet carrier and a 30-knot escort built on a banana boat hull, was its own answer to why the war was lost. The Japanese were not just being outproduced, they had been overwhelmed past their ability to count. In November 1944, a different ship slid down the ways at Yokosuka. Her name was Shinano. She had begun her life as the third hull of the Yamato-class super battleships. Halfway through construction, after Midway, the Navy had converted her into the largest aircraft carrier ever built, 72,000 tons, twice the displacement of an Essex. Her flight deck was armored against 500-kilogram bombs. She was intended to be a floating air base, a fortress to support what was left of the carrier force. She was commissioned on the 19th of November 1944. 10 days later, while making her maiden voyage from Yokosuka to the inland sea, she was found in the dark by the American submarine USS Archerfish. 4 torpedoes, insufficient damage control by a crew that had not yet been trained, watertight doors that had not been sealed, pumps that had not been tested. At 1100 on the 29th of November, Shinano rolled over and sank. She had launched not a single aircraft in combat. The largest aircraft carrier ever built up to that point in history had a combat career measured in hours. By the spring of 1945, the conventional Japanese air defense had collapsed. The remaining pilots had a name for what they were being asked to do: Toko, special attack, suicide. The kamikazes were not what Japanese doctrine had ever envisioned. They were the admission, finally, that doctrine had failed. If a Japanese pilot could no longer expect to survive combat against an American fighter, then his life had become a weapon worth more than the airplane itself. The math was simple and terrible. 1 pilot, 1 airplane, 1 fully loaded enemy carrier. Trade my death for 10,000 of theirs. On the 11th of May 1945, off Okinawa, 2 kamikazes hit USS Bunker Hill 30 seconds apart. Aircraft on a flight deck, fueled and armed for launch, exploded in chain. Fires raged through her hangar for hours. Nearly 400 sailors died. She did not sink. Damage control parties fought the fires through the night. Destroyers came alongside. Tugs took her in tow. She steamed under her own power to Ulithi, then to Pearl Harbor, then to Bremerton, Washington, for repairs. The crew that walked off her in Bremerton looked at their own ship, the gutted hangar, the warped flight deck, the burn marks the size of houses, and they knew it should have been the end of her. It was not. The shipyards put her back together. She missed the rest of the war. She did not miss the war that would have come after, because that war never came. Japan surrendered first. It is easy, looking at a number like 400 dead on one ship in 30 seconds, to think that the kamikazes worked. They did not. They killed more American sailors per attack than any other Japanese weapon of the war. They sank 26 American ships. They damaged over 200. They were terrible. They were tactically brilliant. They were strategically nothing. Because every kamikaze killed his own pilot too. And the Americans had carriers behind their carriers, and the Japanese did not. This brings us at last back to a man named Motomi Ugaki, and to the diary he had been keeping since 1941. In February 1945, Ugaki was given command of the 5th Air Fleet on the southern island of Kyushu. The 5th Air Fleet's primary mission was to direct kamikaze attacks against the American invasion fleet at Okinawa. From a concrete bunker dug into a hillside outside Kanoya, Ugaki spent the spring and early summer signing off on launch orders for young men in their late teens and early 20s, pilots who had been given just enough training to take off and aim. He saw them when they came to receive their final orders. He gave each of them a cup of sake. He watched their aircraft lift off and disappear south. He wrote about them every night in Sensoroku. He wrote without sentiment. He did not glorify them. He did not pity them. He recorded what they had done and where they had hit and what they had failed to hit and how many had returned and how many had not. The entries get shorter as the months pass. The voice in them gets quieter. On the 6th of August 1945, an American B-29 dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima. On the 9th of August, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On the 14th of August, the Emperor recorded an imperial rescript announcing Japan's acceptance of the Allied terms. On the morning of the 15th of August 1945, at noon, his voice was broadcast to the Japanese people for the first time in history. It was a thin, formal voice speaking in the archaic Japanese of the imperial court. Most Japanese could not understand it. But they understood what it meant. The war was over. In his bunker outside Kanoya, Vice Admiral Motomi Ugaki, 55 years old, listened to the broadcast and then sat down at his desk. He opened Sensoroku for the last time. He picked up his pen. He wrote that he had not yet received an official ceasefire order through naval channels. He wrote that he alone bore the responsibility for the failure of the kamikaze campaign to save his country. He wrote that he intended to fly one final mission, to embody personally the spirit of Bushido that he had been ordering younger men to embody for 6 months. He closed the diary. He took off his rank insignia from his collar, the gold cuffs, the cherry blossom on his epaulets. He took down the short ceremonial sword that had been given to him by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto when he was still Yamamoto's chief of staff before the war. He walked out to the airfield. 11 Swiss dive bombers were already warming up. His subordinates protested. They wept. They begged. One young warrant officer, a man named Akiyoshi Endo, whose place on the kamikaze roster Ugaki had taken, refused the order to stand down and forced his way into the same rear cockpit Ugaki was already sitting in. 2 men, where there was room for one. Ugaki, after a long moment, slid sideways to make space. The aircraft took off into the late afternoon light. 11 Swissees lifted from Ota, 3 returned with engine trouble. 8 kept going, south toward Okinawa, toward an enemy fleet that was already preparing to leave for home. At 1924, Endo's voice came over the radio, calmly, professionally, the voice of a young man doing his job, beginning attack run. Then static. The 8 aircraft disappeared. 17 men, including Ugaki, were never seen again. American naval records for the evening of the 15th of August 1945 show no successful kamikaze hits. No ships damaged, no casualties from enemy aircraft, nothing. Wherever they crashed, into the sea, into anti-aircraft fire, into a deserted patch of ocean north of Okinawa, they crashed for nothing. The war they had died to win had ended at noon. They had taken off at sunset. Sensoroku, the war record, ends on a clean page. The last man to use it had carried it for 4 years, through 2 flagships and a near-fatal plane crash and the death of his mentor and the burning of his fleet and the failure of his country. He had written in it almost every day. He had recorded the rise of Japan and the fall of Japan, and he had written the last line less than 4 hours before he died. The diary survived. It was carried out of the Kanoya bunker by a staff officer, hidden, and eventually given to American occupation authorities. It was published in Japan after the war. It was translated into English in 1991 by historians at the University of Pittsburgh under the title Fading Victory. It is today the most honest account of the Pacific War written by any Japanese commander on either side of the bridge. The record of a disciplined, intelligent man watching his world end in slow motion and writing it down because he believed someone, someday, would need to read it. Ozawa survived everything. He sat the bridge through the final defeat. On the 29th of May 1945, the Emperor named him Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the last man to hold that title in the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. There was by then almost no fleet left to command. A handful of submarines, a few damaged cruisers, the shattered remains of a service that had once been the third largest navy in the world. He refused promotion to full admiral. He remained vice admiral until the navy he had served for 46 years was formally dissolved by the occupation authorities in late 1945. He was interrogated courteously by American naval officers in Tokyo in the fall of that year. He answered all their questions. He named the documents. He drew the diagrams. He explained calmly what he had thought and what he had ordered, and why. When asked what had surprised him most about the Battle of the Philippine Sea, he did not talk about Hellcats. He did not talk about radar. He did not talk about proximity fuses. He talked about the count. He had known the Americans had more carriers than he did. He had not known they had 15. And when the reconnaissance photographs came back from Yokosuka, he had refused, at first, to believe the number. He lived another 21 years. He died in Tokyo on the 9th of November 1966, at the age of 80, in a hospital bed, very quietly. He had spent his retirement reading and writing letters and refusing, almost entirely, to give interviews. On the 2nd of September 1945, in Tokyo Bay, 450 American warships rode at anchor under a clear morning sky. The battleship USS Missouri lay in the center of the formation. On her quarterdeck, an Allied delegation in white uniforms waited for a small group of Japanese officials in formal dress to come aboard and sign the instrument of surrender. Overhead, at the moment of the signing, over 400 American aircraft passed in formation: Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers, and the long bombers that had burned the cities. They came from carriers stretched to the horizon: Essex class, Independence class, escort carriers. Most of those carriers had not existed 3 years earlier. Most had been built in shipyards that had not existed 5 years earlier. They had been built by women in coveralls, in 3 shifts, in 18-hour days, in factories whose furnaces had not gone out in 40 months. This is the answer to the question the Japanese admirals never quite let themselves ask, even in their diaries, even in their long post-war interviews. They had not been beaten by tactics. They had not been beaten by braver pilots, or by better admirals, or by the gods of the sea. The men who flew the Hellcats were no braver than the men who flew the Zeros. The men in the Helldivers were not better trained than the men in the Vals, only differently trained, and luckier and more numerous. Mitcher was a brilliant commander. Spruance was a brilliant commander. Ozawa was a brilliant commander. The difference between victory and defeat in the Pacific was not made on any bridge. It was made in Pittsburgh, and in Detroit, and in the river towns of Virginia. It was made by an industrial society that decided, in 1940, to build a 2-ocean navy, and then in 1942 doubled the order, and then in 1943 doubled it again, and then kept building carriers after the order had stopped mattering, until the day in Tokyo Bay when 17 of them had been commissioned and 400 aircraft flew overhead, and there was nothing on the other side of the harbor that could fly anymore. The man who had seen all this coming was Isoroku Yamamoto. He had warned them, in writing in 1941, the half of his letter that frightened them, the half that said a long war was unwinnable. They had simply not sent upstairs. They had kept the part that promised 6 months of victory. They had buried the part that promised everything that came after. Yamamoto had died in the jungle on Bougainville in April 1943, 14 months before the Philippine Sea. He had been killed by P-38s flying from an airfield on Guadalcanal, an island the Japanese had taken and then lost, in a campaign whose pilots had bled away the irreplaceable veterans Ozawa had needed in 1944. He never lived to see Taiho burn. He never lived to see Shokaku roll over. He never lived to see 15 Essex-class carriers ride at anchor in Tokyo Bay. He had told them what would happen. They had not listened. He had not lived to be proven right. That, in the end, is the story. Not a story of weapons, not a story of admirals, not a story of ships, although the ships are what we remember. A story of a warning that was given and silenced and proven true after the man who gave it was dead. The admirals who survived him spent the rest of their lives, Zazawa for 2 decades, Toyoda for another 12 years, Ugaki for less than 4 hours, trying to understand how they had not seen what one man had seen plainly in 1941. The answer, when they were honest, was always the same. They had believed what they wanted to believe, and the Essex carriers, sliding off the ways in Newport News and Brooklyn and Quincy and Norfolk, one every few weeks, year after year, had not cared what anyone in Tokyo believed.